So today I'm at Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek, Michigan. I'm standing next to the Byington family monument, and I want to talk to you about a man by the name of Cornelius Byington, who's actually kind of a forgotten hero here in Battle Creek, and most people probably don't know who he is. His actual grave marker is right over here. And unfortunately, it's been neglected, or it's broken, perhaps by vandalism, or just age, and it deteriorated over the years. It certainly needs to be repaired, and you're going to understand why. So follow me on this journey as we explore some of the history of this man. Come along and join me.
To understand the story of Cornelius Byington, it would seem the place to start would be to examine his family and how they came to live in Battle Creek. In 1846, there was a vacancy at the position of pastor for the Presbyterian Church in Battle Creek, whose congregation at that time was just 138 members. On August 25th of that year, a meeting was held with the trustees of the church, and it was agreed that a call was to be extended to Reverend Joel Byington to come to the emerging city and take the pulpit for 6 months, with the view of becoming a permanent pastor. A collection was taken and a sum of $450 was raised to secure Mr. Byington's transportation and settlement to Battle Creek. Joel Byington was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1783 and had been a minister for at least 25 years on the shores of Lake Champlain in Seige, New York, and was 63 years old when he answered the call and moved with his family to Battle Creek. His family consisted of his wife Delia and 7 children: Electa, Joel Jr., Delia, Samuel, Charlotte, Cornelius, and the youngest, Agnes. His wife Delia was the daughter of Seth Storrs, a Vermont political and civil leader who took part in the founding of Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont. He was also a colonel in the Vermont militia. Her mother was Electa Strong. Electa's grandfather was John Strong, who was a Vermont farmer who served as the Vermont Speaker of the House of Representatives in his time and was also in the militia during the French and Indian War, and later the Revolutionary War, and attained the rank of brigadier general. In 1791, John Strong was a member of the convention that ratified the U.S. Constitution, and it resulted in statehood for Vermont. John Strong's son, Samuel, who was the brother of Electa Storrs, served as a general directing the Vermont militia in the War of 1812. This gives you some understanding of the sense of duty to country that this family held, as well as some of their military history, which is important in understanding the rest of this story about Cornelius Byington. Now, it does not appear that Joel Byington Jr. or Samuel Byington, whose full name was Samuel Strong Byington, made the move to Battle Creek. Joel may have initially remained in New York, but he eventually became a merchant in New Orleans, Louisiana. Samuel remained in New York until about 1850, when he moved to Montgomery, Alabama. More on that later. When Joel Byington made his move to Battle Creek, his son Cornelius was 17 years old. The oldest daughter, Electa, was 26. Joel, who remained in New York, was 24. Delia Elvira was 23, and Samuel Strong was 21. Charlotte was 19, and the youngest daughter, Agnes, was 14. Reverend Joel Byington's wife, Delia, passed away in 1848, just 2 years after their arrival in Battle Creek. The Reverend, based on what I could find on him, appeared to have left his role as pastor here in Battle Creek shortly after that. However, he remained a minister until the time of his death in December 1856, where he passed away just before Christmas in a town called Elizabeth, just outside Galena, Illinois. His body was returned to Battle Creek for burial at Oak Hill Cemetery beside his wife. Delia Elvira married Benjamin Hinman of Battle Creek in 1848, the year her mother passed away. Together they had 2 children, Charles and Julia. Delia passed away in 1881 at the age of 57 following an illness. It was in her obituary that there's a mention of Samuel living in Tennessee at that point, and her other brother, Joel, living in California. Electa, the oldest daughter, married Henry Hinman, Benjamin Hinman's younger brother, in February of 1850. However, she passed away at the young age of 30 in December that same year, shortly after giving birth to her only child, a boy named William Henry Hinman. Charlotte married Frederick Pratt in 1849, who founded the Elkhart Carriage Company in Elkhart, Indiana. The company grew into the Pratt Buggy and Auto Works, one of the most prosperous businesses of its kind in the country in its day. They had two sons, William and George, who took over their father's business. Charlotte passed away in 1914 at the age of 87. Agnes married Alexander Pope, a Scottish immigrant who was a hardware store merchant in Elkhart, Indiana. Agnes and her husband Alexander had two children, and she passed away at the age of 84 in 1919. So now that we have some of his family history, let's explore the story of Cornelius Byington. In the Battle Creek community, he was noted as a vocalist and sang in the Battle Creek Glee Club. His singing group furnished music at the time. At the convention for the newly formed Republican Party, where Abraham Lincoln spoke among other delegates in Kalamazoo in 1856, in favor of presidential candidate John Fremont, who was running against James Buchanan. It was the only time Lincoln was known to have given a speech in Michigan. In 1857, Cornelius Byington served as a village clerk for Battle Creek. In the city election of 1861, just before the Civil War, he ran for the office of city recorder and lost. Ironically, his brother Samuel, age 36, was working as a village clerk in Montgomery, Alabama at the same time. When the Civil War began in 1861, at the age of 32, Cornelius entered service with the Battle Creek Artillery Company, 80 men strong, at its organization, and became the captain on May 10th in Battle Creek, Michigan. When the men gathered at the train station to travel to Detroit, 1,500 people gathered to see them off, which is quite significant because the population of Battle Creek at that point was just around 3,000 people. And a silver cornet band played. Each man was presented with a New Testament by Mrs. Delia Hinman, Cornelius's sister. The local pastor of the Presbyterian Church was there as well, and got each man to pledge to abstain from liquor. Battle Creek was in the Civil War just 18 days after it had started. The men were enthusiastic, and the crowd cheered as the train departed the station. When they arrived in Detroit, their company was merged with 9 other units to become Company C, 2nd Michigan Infantry. The unit at that point consisted of 1,013 men and officers. Originally believing they were volunteering for 90 days of service, the regiment was mustered in after arriving in Detroit on May 25, 1861, for 3 years of service. It was moved to the Virginia field on June 6, and the regiment was among the first to encounter the enemy with a skirmish at Blackburn's Ford on July 18th. When Bull Run came about, the regiment was not an actual participant, but was assigned to cover the retreat, helping to make this battle less of a debacle for the North than it turned out to be. During the winter of 1861 to 1862, the regiment was camped near Alexandria, Virginia in March of 1862, and was later engaged in the Siege of Yorktown in April and May. They later participated in Williamsburg, Four Oaks, the Siege of Fredricksburg, and Malvern, and the Second Battle of Bull Run. Cornelius was eventually promoted and commissioned a major on July 26, 1862. I came across a letter by a man named Richard from Washington, D.C., who was visiting a soldier named David Burrell on July 5, 1862, at an encampment in Virginia. He wrote a letter to his niece, Catherine Burrell, in Detroit about David, whom he had found in good spirits. In the letter, he mentioned mentions the 2nd, the 5th, and the 24th Michigan regiments were encamped there. Catherine was apparently the wife or sister of David. After closing the letter with "Your affectionate Uncle Richard," he writes, "P.S. Matters to me look very discouraging here, but you will take care what you say about anything I write. The sick and wounded are well cared for, although I will visit the hospital in Georgetown." So this kind of gives you some insight to where the war was at for the Union soldiers in 1861 and 1862. From here on, the story gets very interesting. Now, you remember Samuel Byington was serving as a clerk in Montgomery, Alabama. On April 14, 1862, he enlisted at Montevallo, Alabama as a sergeant in Company D, 44th Alabama for the Confederate Army for 3 years. Samuel would serve with Major W.M. Robbins in the 44th Alabama for over a year, until he was stabbed with a bayonet in the breast at Raccoon Mountain near Chattanooga, Tennessee on October 28, 1863. Having seen his wound, his fellow soldiers presumed that he was dead and left him behind as the rest of the unit began the march to Knoxville. He was ultimately taken prisoner by the Union and transferred to Nashville, then to Louisville, and eventually to Camp Morton, Indianapolis, Indiana, where he remained there until he ultimately pledged the Oath of Allegiance on March 27, 1864, and was released from prison. Where he went following his release from there, we can only speculate, but he did not violate his oath and return to the war. He had a sister living in Battle Creek and 2 in Elkhart. In a report written in 1871, years later, he was said to be living in Galena, Illinois, the same town where his father had passed away. At the time of his sister Delia's death in 1881, her obituary had him listed as living in Tennessee. But what's important to note here is how close he was to Knoxville when he was wounded and eventually taken prisoner, as it has a lot to do with Cornelius' story. It was from June through July of 1863 that the Michigan 2nd again distinguished itself under General Grant during the Siege of Vicksburg. Byington later led his troops through the Cumberland Gap to Knoxville, Tennessee, where the troops engaged in battle at Cambell Station. It was following this in November of 1863, on the return to Knoxville, that Major Byington would meet his fate. But before I get into the details of that, I'm now going to take you through some of his personal diary entries in the year 1863. To give you a personal perspective on the final year of his life. This diary begins with the first entry on March 1st, 1863, where he is in Newport News, Virginia. He notes that here. There are also some notations from January through March 1st, but they are mostly just numeric entries and no written entries about what was happening. From March 1st to March 8th, he discusses a trip he took to Norfolk on the 7th, returning on the 8th aboard the Georgiana. On March 19th, he writes, "Embarked at Newport News aboard Georgiana and anchorage off Fortress Monroe. A severe snowstorm with high winds spinning us about now and continuing all day. Friday, March 20th, stayed all night at our anchorage. Storm still rages." And then on March 22nd, a Sunday, he writes, "Embarked at Parkersburg," and then makes mention of a telegraph he received for orders related to Cincinnati. So it sounds like he's discussing moving the troops by rail to Parkersburg, West Virginia, and then on to Cincinnati, which aligns with later entries. Then the diary has no entries until June, where he writes on the 4th of June, "Left camp at Columbia, marched as far as Campbellsville, 22 miles. Columbia and Campbellsville are in Kentucky. The next several entries have him marching to Lebanon, then taking a rail to Louisville, then continuing on the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad to Vincennes, Indiana, then on to Sandoval, Illinois, and having dinner in Centralia, before finally taking a train south to Cairo, a port town on the Mississippi River. From Cairo, the troops are moved by way of ferry boats on the Mississippi between June 9th and through June 14th, stopping for 2 days in Memphis on the way to Vicksburg. From June 14th through the 21st, his troops are in motion around Vicksburg, moving into position to support Grant's troops that had been there since March. He makes several mentions along the way of hearing cannonading and heavy firing. After June 21st, he makes no entries until Vicksburg surrenders on July 4th. The Michigan 2nd was involved in the siege of Vicksburg, so he probably did not have a lot of time to make diary entries during this period. On July 4th, he writes, "Heard that Vicksburg had surrendered and marched from camp at Flower Hill Church to Young's on the road to Big Black." Big Black was the name of a river north of Vicksburg. On July 5th and 6th, his troops are again in motion, and there's several entries on this. On July 6th, though, he describes the day's events and then closes with a sentence that reads, "Received a letter from Agnes." Agnes, if you remember, is his younger sister. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Following Vicksburg, the Michigan 2nd was involved in the siege of Jackson from July 10th through the 17th. On July 11th, Byington describes one of their engagements as, "Were sent forward as skirmishes and after a while met the Rebs. 4 of our men were wounded. A double quick was ordered. 7 companies moved up gallantly, driving the 7th to their rifle kits." He then has some figures that read 2 plus 50 men we lost, which I assume that means a tabulation of men lost in the battle. From there, the Michigan 2nd was involved in the destruction of the Mississippi Central Railroad at Madison Station from July 18th to the 22nd, although his diary shows their only involvement was on July 18th and 19th. His entry on July 18th reads, "Marched at 6 a.m. to Madison Station on the Mississippi Central Railroad. Spent the day after arrival in tearing up and burning railroad, thus bending the rails. The station house was also burned, but the cotton around was not. Why not let the house remain and burn the cotton? As those is security force cash bonds in England." Sunday, July 19th, he writes, "The destruction of the railroad still continues. About 11 a.m. commenced a march towards Jackson, arriving at 5 p.m. Visited the city, much injured by fire." Moving forward in the diary to July 24th, there's some more interesting notations. On July 24th, he writes, "Visited Vicksburg in the company with Lieutenant Colonel Dillman. Wrote a letter to Joel and mailed it." Saturday, July 25th, much to my astonishment, received a visit from Joel. Now, if you remember at the beginning of this video, Joel was living in New Orleans around this time. The information I had found was that he was a merchant in New Orleans. So New Orleans is not that far from where he's at in the Jackson area of Mississippi, Vicksburg. His entry on July 26 went with brother to landing at Snyder's Bluffs. So I think that was a port on the Mississippi, and his brother probably came up on the Mississippi to visit him. Seeing that Joel stayed overnight, want to bet they spent a lot of the evening talking about Samuel? Would have loved to have been a fly on the wall on that conversation. Thursday, July 30th, Lieutenant Colonel Dillman's resignation tendered yesterday was returned accepted. I was curious as to why Dillman may have resigned. I found one article that dated on July 25th, 1863 that ran in the Iowa Transcript, which indicated that he had been wounded in his left arm in a report to his commander, which was dated on July 5th. And in this letter, he sounds confident, stating that there is not a man in the army here that has any more doubt that we will take Vicksburg in a short time. So I can only speculate on why he resigned. I also came across an entry in another blog site about the Michigan 2nd that he was only temporarily installed as the commander of the unit. So perhaps this was when he stepped down and turned the command back over to the general that gave him the temporary command. There's no other mentions of this Lieutenant Dillman in Byington's diaries, so there's some missing information there. Following these entries, his troops are moved back up the Mississippi to Cairo, then to Indianapolis by railroad, and eventually back into Tennessee, where from September 7th through the 9th, they took part in the fall of the Cumberland Gap, an important route of travel near Knoxville. From September 27th through mid-October, they're camped near Knoxville and moving around Knoxville, and he's got several entries about their movements during this period. Now we come to the final entries in his diary. On November 16th, he writes, "Early took up our march towards Knoxville, skirmishing and ending the day with the Battle of Cambell's Mill." Now, Cambell's Mill became recorded as the Battle of Cambell Station. And then he writes, "Returned to Knoxville during the night." Tuesday, November 17th, arrived at Knoxville around 4 a.m., took position on hill, built rifle pits. So here they're moving into the defense of Knoxville because they've got word that Confederate troops are moving towards them. Wednesday, November 18th, same position behind rifle pits. Thursday, November 19th, still in same position as yesterday. So November 19th was the last entry that he makes in his diary. On Tuesday, November 24th, Major Byington was wounded and ultimately taken to a Confederate field hospital. In an article written in the Newtown Bee in Newtown, Connecticut on January 12th, 1881, some 17 years after the incident, Major William Robinson of the 4th Alabama Infantry, Confederate Army, wrote about the charge that morning. It reads, "As soon as daylight revealed to the Federals our new line of rifle pits, suddenly we beheld, springing over their earthworks and dashing impetuously down the slope towards us, a strong body of men, about 200 strong, which we soon afterward found was the 2nd Michigan Regiment, led by Major Byington, and sent to dislodge us from our new position. I hurried up in a moment the reserve battalion of the 4th Alabama to reinforce the men in the pits, and then ensued for a few minutes one of the fiercest and deadliest combats of the war. These two veteran regiments, both having come to the field at the first sound of the tocsin." Tocsin refers to a signal or a bell that would raise alarm to draw people together, as you might use on calling troops to a battlefield. As the names show, 2nd Michigan and 4th Alabama, thinned now by hard service and many battles to about 200 men each, but every man of them utterly fearless, splendidly daring, and knowing all about war, grappled with each other in a death grip. He then goes on to write, "The circumstance quickly decided the contest in our favor, alas, for the high hearts that were still there forever. Major Byington displayed a heroism worthy of the leader of such men, or of any men. He came on, sword in hand, in front of his line, exhorting them to follow him to victory, and rushed to the very brink of our rifle pits, where he fell desperately wounded within a few feet of me. I had him carried back to a little piece of woods in our rear, and made as comfortable as possible till he could be sent to the hospital. His leg was broken, and he was shot also in the side, but bad as these wounds were, he seemed to suffer little pain. If any surviving relative of Major Byington shall read this sketch, I can say for their consolation that every possible kindness was shown that gallant gentleman." There are accounts that said that Byington ordered his retreating comrades to leave him to the mercy of the enemy and save the regiment. With Major Robbins' account of the event, it is possible he gave orders to his men as they were retreating or came near him before he was moved from the field of battle. It could also be that this is part of post-Civil War folklore created by his comrades when they returned home. No matter which is true, it's commonly agreed that he was taken to a Confederate field hospital and at first was believed to be on the road to recovery. In this article that ran in the Philadelphia Age on December 14th, they wrote that his wounds were severe but not mortal. In a handwritten letter written in January 1864 by an officer with the initials D.B.H., he describes Cornelius Byington's death following his leg being amputated in a Confederate hospital. So it sounds like infections set in, which were so common in those days at field hospitals. He ultimately died on December 11th, 1863. Cornelius Byington was 34 years old. Another interesting point to consider on this, had Samuel not been wounded near Chattanooga and been taken prisoner, which happened just before the Battle of Knoxville, he would have continued on to Knoxville with his regiment and perhaps been firing on his own brother. Another interesting note is in Bernice Bryant Lowe's Tales of Battle Creek, where she mentions Major Cornelius Byington's body returning to Battle Creek on New Year's Eve. She said that his funeral was held on one of the coldest days in the city's history and that his body had arrived by train. During his funeral procession, one of the horses waiting in the procession froze to death. Ultimately, he was buried across from his parents' monument at Oak Hill Cemetery, and today his tombstone is faded and sadly broken. The sacrifice that he made on that field of battle that cold November day in Knoxville is unknown to most who visit the cemetery. However, after his death, a fort just west of Knoxville was named after him. It was one of 20 named Union fortifications surrounding Knoxville, 8 forts and 12 batteries, forming a ring during the Civil War defending the city. They were established to defend Knoxville from the Confederates and were the primary line of defense against General Longstreet's siege on the city that November in 1863, which took the life of Major Byington. Today, Fort Byington is still remembered in that city, although the fort ceased to exist after 1865. The location is now the site of Ayers Hall of the University of Tennessee, referred to as The Hill. There's several historical markers on the campus and on the site, one referring to Fort Byington. On this map, represented by the letter B, is where the marker stands in Knoxville. And the letter A on the map is where Fort Byington once stood, which is now Ayers Hall. Of the 198 men from the Union that were sent into that charge, 147 were killed or wounded. Another Battle Creek recruit serving in the 2nd Michigan, 2nd Lieutenant Charles Galpin, who was a printer by profession when he enlisted, he was killed in the action at the same siege on the 24th of November. He's buried in the Knoxville Historic Cemetery. He was just 22 years old when he died. One of the batteries was named in his honor. Here on this map shows where that battery would have been located, represented by the letter C. 2 other men from Detroit also died in that siege. 2nd Lieutenant Frank Zollner, age 28, and 1st Lieutenant William Noble, age 21. Zollner and Noble also had batteries named in their honor outside of Fort Byington. Zollner is represented on this map by the letter D and Noble as the letter E in relationship to the Fort Byington and historic marker. Like Major Byington, Galpin and Zollner were both wounded and died later in December from their injuries. William Noble never made it off the battlefield. In the post-Civil War years, the Grand Army of the Republic, a fraternity of veterans, in 1885 honored the legacy of Major Byington and other fallen comrades in a special day of ceremonies around town. As part of this ceremony, Helen Hinman, the grandniece of Cornelius Byington, was adopted as a daughter of the regiment in his honor. Helen was the daughter of Charles Hinman, whose mother was Cornelius's sister, Delia, who you may remember from the beginning of this video. The Grand Army of the Republic later set up a Camp Byington near Battle Creek, which they used for gatherings for many years. The story of the Byington family and the brothers who fought on opposite sides in the Civil War is one that has been lost to obscurity, like so many stories of this long forgotten conflict. How the brothers felt about each other and what the family thought of them is impossible to fathom. I know in doing the research and creation of this video, at times I felt the magnitude of the entire event so strongly that I had to take a break and return to it later. It has been the most difficult one I have created to date. I, for one, would like to see Cornelius Byington remembered for more than just a broken tombstone. He should be given the same regard as one of Battle Creek's greatest heroes. I'm sure those who knew him at his time would probably want this. At the very least, his headstone should be repaired again and perhaps a historic marker placed beside it, sharing some of his legacy. But let me know your thoughts on this.
It's going to do it for today's tour through history and looking at the story of Cornelius Byington. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked today's video, please take a minute to hit the like button down there, subscribe to the channel, and of course share the video with others. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.